Somewhere on a golf course this weekend, a foursome is walking off the first tee. 3 men, 1 woman. She joined the group an hour earlier. A last-minute fourth, the starter paired up to keep the tee sheet moving. Nobody said anything unkind. Nobody was rude. But there was a small pause when she walked up. The kind of beat that tells a person something without a single word being spoken. The men were recalculating. Would this round take longer? Would she keep up off the tee? Would the joking change? The language soften? The competitive edge shift? None of them said any of that out loud. Most would deny thinking it at all if you asked them directly. But talk to men privately, away from the course, away from their own group, and a more honest picture starts to form. This is not a piece about blame. It is about what actually happens in research and in candid conversation when a woman joins a men's foursome. And what happens by the back 9, more often than not, surprises the men more than anyone else standing on that tee box. Start with the assumption that shows up first, before a single ball is even struck. Pace of play. Ask most club members why a mixed group makes them nervous, and pace is usually the first word out of their mouth. The belief runs deep across public and private courses alike, and it has a long history behind it. For most of the 20th century, many American clubs formally restricted women to certain tee times, often mid-morning on weekdays, under the assumption that women's golf was slower, more social, and less serious than men's golf. Some clubs went further still, barring women from the course entirely on Saturday mornings. The traditional block reserved for men's competitive play, a practice that persisted at some private clubs into the 1970s. That scheduling habit has mostly disappeared on paper, but the underlying assumption never fully left the culture. Yet when researchers and course operators have looked closely at round times by group composition, the picture generally does not support the fear. The National Golf Foundation and various course management studies over the past 2 decades have repeatedly found that slower rounds correlate far more with group size, cart policy, and course difficulty than with who happens to be standing on the tee. A group of 4 strangers unfamiliar with a course routinely plays slower than a mixed group of regulars who know the layout and each other's tendencies. A confident woman playing from tees suited to her own carry distance often plays a more efficient hole, since shorter approach shots and less time spent searching for wayward drives actually speed up play. Compare that to a man over-swinging from tees that do not match his own game, hitting from a distance better suited to a scratch player than to his actual handicap, then spending several extra minutes hunting through the rough for a ball he sliced well offline. Efficient golf is about decision speed and course management, not raw swing speed. That single correction, made honestly, dismantles most of the pace anxiety before the round even begins. The second assumption sits quietly underneath the first, and it is about ability. Many men entering a mixed group brace for a weaker link, someone who will need extra help, extra patience, extra rules bent in her favor. This is where the data becomes genuinely interesting. The USGA handicap system, first standardized nationally in 1911 and refined many times since, exists precisely because raw distance is not the same thing as scoring skill. The current World Handicap System, adopted in the United States in 2020 and built to unify 5 previously separate national systems, including the USGA system and the systems used in Europe, Australia, South Africa, and Argentina, was designed in part to make comparisons across genders and skill levels more consistent and fair through a shared course rating and slope rating framework. Consider a woman swinging at a moderate, controlled clubhead speed, say around 70 miles per hour, playing to her actual handicap of 15 or 18. She often posts more consistent scores than a higher handicap man swinging at 95 or 100 miles per hour, but far less accurately, spraying drives into hazards and compounding one bad shot into a double or triple bogey. Consistency, not clubhead speed, is what keeps a group moving and what keeps a scorecard respectable. Men who have played regularly alongside strong women players tend to describe the same realization. The initial worry about ability quietly evaporates somewhere around the third or fourth hole. That is usually once the group actually watches her play, rather than assumes how she will play. Some point specifically to watching a shorter hitter consistently find fairways and greens, while their own longer, wilder drives cost them strokes, and describe it as a genuinely humbling adjustment to their assumptions. A few even admit the experience changed how they talk to their own daughters or nieces about the game, no longer assuming that shorter distance off the tee means a lesser golfer. The third layer is less about performance and more about comfort, and it is the one men are least willing to admit publicly. Informal reader polls and conversations captured by golf publications over the years, including surveys run by Golf Digest and Golf.com among their readership, point to a consistent theme. A meaningful share of men report low-level anxiety before a mixed round, not about her golf, but about themselves. Will a joke land wrong? Will normal course language need editing? Will the usual needling between playing partners feel appropriate anymore? This anxiety is not new. It echoes a much older, more formal discomfort. Well into the 1980s, and in some cases the 1990s, many private clubs maintained separate clubhouse entrances, separate grill rooms, and separate tee time blocks for men and women. Arrangements that reinforced the idea that golf itself was gendered space rather than shared space. Some clubs required women to be accompanied by a male member simply to use the main dining room, and a number of clubs kept these rules on their books, even as the surrounding legal landscape shifted, including the passage of Title IX in 1972, which reshaped access to golf at the collegiate level far faster than it changed private club culture. Augusta National, one of the most visible clubs in the sport, did not admit its first female members until 2012, when Condoleezza Rice and Darla Moore joined, a full 80 years after the club was founded in 1932. Against that backdrop, a bit of lingering social awkwardness on a random Saturday foursome looks less like an isolated quirk and more like a faint echo of decades of formal separation. But the same polls consistently show that this discomfort fades fast, usually within the first few holes, once the group settles into a normal rhythm. The overwhelming majority of men who complete a full round in a mixed group report enjoying it as much or more than an all-male round. The awkwardness lives almost entirely in anticipation, not in the actual experience. The fourth movement is where the real friction still exists, and it deserves honesty rather than a tidy bow. Unsolicited advice is the most commonly cited irritation among women who regularly play mixed golf, showing up repeatedly in surveys conducted by women's golf associations and in the comment sections of golf media aimed at female players. A tip on grip, stance, or swing, offered without being asked, usually from a man with a similar or worse handicap, remains a persistent pattern. It is rarely meant as an insult. It often comes from a genuine, if clumsy, instinct to help, sometimes rooted in an era when women were actively discouraged from taking lessons at all, and were instead expected to learn informally from husbands, brothers, or fathers on the course itself. In the early decades of American club golf, women were frequently barred from formal instruction programs and pro shop lesson tee bookings during peak hours, pushing them toward this informal, secondhand style of learning by default rather than choice. That historical babysitting dynamic has outlived the circumstances that created it. The effect on the receiving end is the opposite of helpful. It signals an assumption of lesser competence before any shot has even been evaluated. A related pattern shows up around tee selection. Women are sometimes steered toward forward tees by default, regardless of their actual distances, rather than asked what tee matches their game. This mirrors an old structural habit as well. For decades, course scorecards listed only a single set of forward tees, labeled simply as the ladies' tees, with no distance customization at all, as though every woman golfer carried the exact same yardage regardless of skill or strength. Modern course design has moved toward multiple tee options labeled by distance rather than gender, a shift promoted heavily by organizations like the United States Golf Association through initiatives such as Tee It Forward, launched in 2011 to encourage all golfers, regardless of gender, to choose tees based on actual driving distance. Yet the social habit of assuming rather than asking has lagged behind the actual infrastructure. Both patterns come from the same root. Golf culture still defaults to treating the female player as a variation from a male standard, rather than as a player with her own baseline entirely. Men who have unlearned this habit describe a simple shift in mindset. Ask what tee she plays from. Ask before offering a tip. Treat the request for input as something she initiates, not something she receives. The final movement looks at where all of this is heading, and the trend line is genuinely encouraging. Participation data compiled by the National Golf Foundation over the last several years shows women now making up close to a quarter of golfers in the United States, up from roughly 19% a decade earlier, a shift representing several million new players entering the game. Junior girls represent one of the fastest-growing segments in the sport, with participation numbers roughly doubling in youth programs like the PGA Junior League since the mid-2010s. The LPGA, founded in 1950 by 13 pioneering professional golfers, including Babe Zaharias and Patty Berg, has spent the better part of the last decade investing heavily in girls' development programs specifically aimed at normalizing early exposure to the game before the social hesitations of adulthood ever take hold, including initiatives like LPGA Girls Golf, which now operates chapters across dozens of states. Clubs that have leaned into mixed-format events, rather than segregating men's and women's play entirely, report higher retention among newer female members, according to figures shared by the National Club Association. The reasoning tracks with everything already discussed. Mixed play, done well, removes the isolation that used to push women toward all-female leagues out of necessity rather than preference. A necessity that existed for real historical reasons when women were formally or informally excluded from men's tee times altogether. It also quietly educates men, round by round, out of assumptions that golf culture handed them decades ago through separate entrances, separate scorecards, and separate expectations. None of this erases the residual friction. Unsolicited tips have not disappeared. Some starters still pair groups with visible hesitation. But the overall shift among regular mixed foursomes points toward normalization, not tension. The version of golf where a woman joining a group causes a pause on the first tee is slowly becoming the exception rather than the rule. What this all adds up to is a fairly simple takeaway. The nervousness some men feel before a mixed round is real, but it is almost never about her golf. It is about their own uncertainty, often inherited from decades of a golf culture that quietly taught them to expect something less. That uncertainty dissolves quickly once the group actually plays together. The lingering problems that remain, the unsolicited tips, the default tee assumptions, are fixable with a small shift in habit rather than a large cultural overhaul. Golf works better for everyone in the group when a woman is evaluated by her own game. That beats measuring her against an assumption of what her game must be. So here is a genuine question worth leaving in the comments. If you have played in a mixed foursome recently, what actually happened? Was the awkwardness real, or did it disappear by the third hole the way the research suggests? Subscribe to the Ladies' Caddy.